The grim, sterile atmosphere of the prison infirmary was a fitting backdrop to the man's impending end. Johnny Armitage lay in his bed, tubes and machines keeping him tethered to life for a few more hours or days. His body, once fit and strong, now withered and frail, betrayed the years of punishment he'd endured behind bars. The clock ticked relentlessly as the shadow of death loomed ever closer. Johnny had been serving a life sentence for a crime he'd committed over 3 decades ago, a crime that had seemingly been solved, leaving no questions behind. But as the days wore on, Johnny began to grow restless. He knew the end was near, and with that knowledge came a powerful urge to speak the truth. Truths that had been buried for years, hidden under layers of lies and a carefully constructed facade. He had spent countless years behind bars, haunted by the knowledge of a secret he had sworn to protect. But now, with nothing left to lose, Johnny decided to tell someone, anyone, the things he'd been carrying. The dying man's confession would shatter everything people thought they knew about the case. But who would listen? A letter was written, a long, cryptic note addressed to someone outside the walls of the prison, someone who might still care about the truth. Johnny wasn't sure if it would make it into the right hands, but he had no choice. He couldn't take this secret to the grave. The truth had festered for too long, and the time to release it was now. In the letter, Johnny hinted at a larger conspiracy, a miscarriage of justice that had been carefully hidden for decades. The details were vague, yet the tone was undeniable. This wasn't just a man trying to clear his conscience. Johnny knew that his confession would unleash something far bigger than himself. The world had moved on from the crime years ago, the public long since satisfied with the outcome. Yet Johnny's admission was about to disrupt the peace, stirring up long-buried questions that had been silenced. As the letter was passed on, a chain of events would soon unfold, leading to a shocking revelation about a decades-old crime. It was the kind of crime that gripped an entire city, leaving the community reeling in disbelief. 25 years ago, a prominent businessman named Richard Ellis was found brutally murdered in his home. The case had all the makings of a high-profile tragedy: wealth, power, a high-society family, and a mystery that demanded answers. The police, under immense pressure to solve the crime, quickly zeroed in on Johnny Armitage, a former associate of Ellis who had been embroiled in a bitter legal dispute with him. The evidence against Johnny seemed ironclad: fingerprints, a motive tied to financial ruin, and a confession that seemed genuine. The trial was swift, and Johnny was convicted without question. The case was closed, and justice was served. Or so the public thought. The town moved on, and the scandal faded into the past, relegated to the pages of history. But in the years that followed, doubts began to creep in. People wondered, had the right man been convicted? Now, in the midst of Johnny's confession, the crime was once again thrust into the public eye. The victim's family, long satisfied with the outcome of the trial, began to question everything they thought they knew about the case. Was Johnny truly guilty, or had they all been lied to? The shockwaves of the original crime were still felt by those closest to it. Ellis's widow, who had once held Johnny responsible for her husband's death, and the investigators who had pored over every detail of the case. There had always been something off about the way the crime had been handled, but it had been buried beneath layers of success and closure. Now, as Johnny's confession reached those who had a stake in the case, the unthinkable was beginning to surface. The crime that had rocked the community was now poised to shatter the fragile certainty of justice. Johnny Armitage had never been a saint. Before his conviction, he was known as a man of ambition, willing to do whatever it took to succeed in the cutthroat world of business. His relationship with Richard Ellis had been turbulent from the start. Johnny had worked for Ellis at one point, and their partnership had flourished for years. But greed and pride eventually tore them apart. The legal battle between them had been bitter, and Johnny's name had become synonymous with dishonesty and deceit in the eyes of the public. After the murder, Johnny was seen as the perfect scapegoat, someone who had the motive and the means to commit such an atrocious act. In prison, Johnny's life was nothing like the one he had once dreamed of. The reality of life behind bars was harsh, stripping him of everything he had once known. His days were filled with the monotony of confinement, and the only thing he had left to cling to was the hope that somehow he might get out. Over the years, Johnny wrestled with guilt, shame, and the knowledge that his life was a twisted wreck. He had become a hollow shell of the man he once was, haunted by his past decisions. He spent years writing letters to lawyers and trying to get his case reopened, but no one believed him. His cries for help fell on deaf ears. As the years wore on, Johnny began to wonder if he would ever escape his fate. But then something inside him changed. With his health deteriorating and death approaching, Johnny realized he had nothing left to lose. His desire for redemption, no matter how impossible it seemed, grew stronger than the fear of exposing his darkest secrets. The truth about that crime, locked away for so long, had to come to light before it was too late. He knew that revealing the truth would cost him, but it was the only way to make amends for the life he had destroyed. Johnny's confession, when it finally arrived, was not a simple matter of admitting guilt or innocence. It was a revelation of far-reaching consequences, a Pandora's box of secrets that had been buried deep in the past. In the quiet corners of the prison, Johnny had overheard whispers, pieced together bits of overheard conversations, and uncovered startling inconsistencies in the investigation. It was these fragments of truth that he now wanted to reveal. He was not the mastermind behind the murder of Richard Ellis, nor had he ever been. In fact, Johnny had been framed, set up as the perfect fall guy. But the real criminals were far more dangerous and powerful than he had ever imagined. Johnny knew that, for years, a hidden group of influential people had conspired to keep the truth buried. They had used their power to ensure that Johnny was convicted, even though the evidence pointing to his guilt had been fabricated. They had played the system to their advantage, manipulating everything from the investigation to the trial. Johnny's final confession was not just a statement of his innocence, it was an indictment of the people who had ruined his life. In his letter, Johnny referred to a third party who had been responsible for the crime, someone with far more power than anyone realized. But the details were vague, and the further Johnny went into his confession, the more the pieces seemed to fall into place. As the recipient of the letter began to investigate, they found themselves standing at the precipice of a much larger conspiracy, one that could unravel the very fabric of the town's justice system. Johnny's claim wasn't just shocking, it was potentially devastating. Every clue he had dropped pointed to one terrifying truth. The real criminals had been hiding in plain sight. But who could they trust? As the suspense built, the walls around Johnny's confession began to close in, and the danger of unveiling the truth became more apparent. Would the truth set Johnny free, or would it condemn him to a final tragic fate? The letter Johnny wrote was not just a simple confession, but a chilling puzzle that would take the recipient, an ambitious investigative journalist named Sarah Blackwell, on a perilous journey into the unknown. When Sarah first received the letter, she thought it was another desperate plea from an inmate clinging to hope, asking for attention. But the words within caught her off guard. The cryptic nature of the letter immediately raised her suspicions. Johnny didn't outright confess to a crime. Instead, he hinted at a much larger, far-reaching conspiracy, something that had been overlooked for years. He mentioned a third party, a person whose identity remained carefully concealed, yet Johnny promised the truth would be revealed if she could piece it together. The letter was filled with names, dates, and fragmented memories, and it felt like a map leading to something much darker. Sarah couldn't ignore the weight behind the words. Something about Johnny's tone told her he wasn't just seeking redemption. He was trying to right a wrong that could destroy lives. Curiosity gnawed at Sarah, and she knew she couldn't ignore the lead. But as she prepared to investigate further, she felt the heaviness of the situation sink in. This wasn't just a forgotten case. It was the kind of story that could make or break careers, but also one that could be dangerous to uncover. The letter spoke of high-ranking individuals who were directly involved in the murder. Names Sarah knew were connected to powerful people in the community. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, She realized that Johnny was offering her the chance to expose something far more sinister than a mere case of murder. But would anyone believe her? More importantly, would they be able to stop the forces that had orchestrated the crime decades ago? The first hint had been dropped, and now Sarah had to decide if she was willing to dig deeper. As Sarah began to probe deeper into the chilling claim Johnny had made, the news of his confession started to spread through the prison system, and from there, it leaked out to the public. The media quickly caught wind of the dying man's words, and the town that had long since put the crime behind them began to buzz with uncertainty. Was Johnny telling the truth, or was he simply a man seeking attention in his final days? Family members of the victim, Richard Ellis, reacted strongly to the allegations. Ellis's widow, Margaret, had spent years grieving the loss of her husband and fighting for justice, convinced that Johnny had been the one to take him away from her. She had built her life on the belief that the right man had been convicted. Now, faced with the possibility that she might have been wrong all these years, her world began to unravel. She was torn between the grief of her husband's loss and the growing doubt planted by Johnny's confession. Law enforcement, too, found themselves in a precarious position. Detective Tom Garcia, who had worked the Ellis case, had been one of the first to dismiss the idea that the wrong man had been convicted. He had followed the evidence, and in his eyes, the case was closed. But Johnny's claim gnawed at him. Garcia had always had questions, little inconsistencies that didn't make sense, but they were too minor to raise alarm at the time. Now, with Sarah's investigation intensifying, he found himself revisiting every detail of the case. Could he have missed something? Were there pieces of the puzzle that had been conveniently overlooked? As the community began to divide, with some vehemently supporting Johnny's confession and others dismissing it as a desperate plea for attention, the tension reached a boiling point. Everyone had a stake in the outcome, and with each passing day, it became clear that there were powerful forces working to keep the truth buried. But who were they? Sarah, unable to shake the feeling that there was more to Johnny's confession than met the eye, arranged a visit to the prison where he was confined. The meeting was tense, each word carefully measured, each glance fraught with meaning. Johnny, in his frail state, was no longer the powerful man he had once been, but his mind was still sharp, and he spoke with a quiet authority that commanded attention. Sarah had come prepared with a list of questions, but Johnny's response was far more than she had expected. He spoke of the night of Richard Ellis's murder, recounting events that didn't line up with what had been reported during the investigation. Johnny described how he had been framed by a person he once trusted, someone he had worked with closely for years. But this person, Johnny revealed, had been far more dangerous than anyone knew. The man Johnny pointed to was a well-known political figure, someone with enough power to manipulate the investigation and silence anyone who posed a threat to the truth. As Johnny's revelations continued, Sarah's skepticism began to crumble. The pieces Johnny presented fit together like a puzzle, each piece adding to the terrifying picture of corruption and deceit. However, Johnny wasn't finished. He hinted that there were others involved, people who had helped cover up the truth, and that the real murderer might still be out there, walking free. As Sarah listened, she could feel the walls of the prison closing in around her. This wasn't just a case of a man trying to clear his name. It was the beginning of a conspiracy that stretched far beyond anything she had imagined. The more Johnny spoke, the more she realized that her investigation was putting her directly in the crosshairs of powerful individuals who would stop at nothing to keep the truth buried. Johnny's final request was simple: expose them. But the price for doing so was something Sarah hadn't fully prepared for. Armed with Johnny's cryptic confessions, Sarah began to piece together a theory that was as shocking as it was dangerous. The more she dug, the more the evidence began to lead her to a new suspect, someone completely unexpected. As she re-examined old case files, she uncovered a pattern of deliberate missteps made by the original investigators. Key evidence had been ignored, potential witnesses had been dismissed, and certain pieces of physical evidence had conveniently disappeared. The new theory Sarah began to develop suggested that the person who had been convicted of Richard Ellis's murder wasn't just a pawn in a much larger game. Johnny was right. He had been framed by a group of powerful individuals who wanted to silence Ellis for good. Ellis had been on the verge of exposing a scandal involving corrupt officials, and his death had been part of a larger cover-up. Johnny's role had been minimized. He had been the scapegoat, used to divert suspicion from the real criminals. As Sarah's investigation progressed, she realized that the truth was much darker and far-reaching than she had ever anticipated. The people involved in the cover-up were not only well-connected, but willing to go to great lengths to protect their secrets. Sarah's own life was now in danger as she neared the heart of the conspiracy. Every step she took closer to the truth made her a bigger target. The puzzle was coming together, but the closer she got to solving it, the more perilous her situation became. As she compiled her findings, she had a choice to make: expose the truth and risk her life, or walk away and let the past remain buried. But the more Sarah thought about the lives affected by the crime, the more she knew there was no turning back. The final pieces were falling into place, and Sarah was about to uncover a truth that would change everything. The chilling truth finally emerged. Richard Ellis hadn't been murdered by Johnny Armitage. He had been killed because he had stumbled onto a massive criminal enterprise involving several high-ranking politicians and business elites. Ellis had discovered a secret scheme that was worth billions: illegal land deals, money laundering, and political corruption of the highest order. These figures had everything to lose if Ellis went public with his findings. Johnny, who had once worked with Ellis in a joint business venture, had become a pawn in their game. He had been framed for murder in a meticulously planned operation designed to divert attention from the real culprits. The betrayal ran deep. Ellis's own allies, who had been complicit in the conspiracy, turned on him when they realized he had uncovered their darkest secrets. As Johnny's confession unraveled this terrifying reality, Sarah found herself thrust into a world where the stakes were no longer just about solving a crime. It was about survival. The true masterminds behind the murder were not just political figures. They were the very people who controlled the town's economy, its law enforcement, and its public perception. Sarah's investigation had unwittingly brought her into the path of these dangerous individuals, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to silence her. But Johnny's final wish had already been set in motion. Sarah knew that exposing the truth would be the ultimate test, not just of her skills as a journalist, but of her resolve to stand up against powerful figures who had manipulated the law for their own benefit. What do you think about the inmate's shocking confession? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories like this one.